Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Very empowering to see so many women, no offense, friend, in this space. And I really love the diversity. It's actually very comforting for me. So, I can't wait till you guys are out there. That's personal. That has nothing to do with why we're here today. No, my name is, I'm Rana Bokhari. I'm a lawyer by profession. I've been a lawyer for about 10 years. Graduated from the University of Manitoba. My entire political career has been in Manitoba. I have a criminology degree, a psychology degree. I did my pre-masters in criminology before I went to law school, which is why I take a very particular approach to crime prevention, homelessness, and all of these things. So just from some of that background. I used to be I was the former Liberal leader in a very young life of mine. In my early 30s. I learned a lot from that experience. It was a very difficult experience. And now this is kind of my second time to kind of re-own that space a little bit and to perhaps create some space for folks like me. And my real importance and why I'm here, why I'm running for this position is I believe that we have failed society. I come from a very strong value system that there is enough to go around in this world. I don't believe that there should be anyone living in destitute, regardless of who they are and where they come from. I believe that we make excuses in an effort to make ourselves feel good when we see people on the street, but we really don't want to take action. And I think it's time to really take a human rights approach to what we are seeing in the city across the board, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's transit, whether it's housing, or anything else. So I will leave it at that. I know you will have a lot of questions, and we'll be able to expand on all that I said. So
let's begin with transit. Emma Honeybun.
Hi there, I'm Emma. I have follow-up questions, but just as a general start, what are your thoughts on the transit system right now, and how are you planning to increase ridership?
Excellent question. So the transit system right now was not built, was not created, was not designed for the city that we are living in today. It was never designed for the type of expansion. It was never designed for sprawl. And frankly, it wasn't really designed for safety. It wasn't designed for specifically the safety of women and newcomers. It just was there to serve a purpose, and we've kind of followed that purpose as if it was the right thing to do without really reflecting on it from a current demographic process. So then what you see is a city council coming out with this master plan, right? So I think that they did, I can commend that effort. I can commend that effort that they went back and they looked at the master plan and they designed this plan to kind of reflect all these things that I'm talking about. A transit system that has to match the city that it services. So I think that basically leads us into what we are dealing with right now. So for your question, I think lack of frequency, lack of safety, lack of kinds of buses, just very not effective service is what I would say. So that's where the kind of turning point comes, where we have to start thinking about what tomorrow looks like.
Thank you. You had mentioned in your pledges that you want to fast track the Winnipeg Transit Master Plan. How long do you think it will take your fast track?
I spent 7 years of my legal career negotiating with federal and provincial governments for money that they actually have, that they're willing to put out. We just have to, understand, it's like negotiations one-on-one, right? We need to know what they want and they need to know what we want. But I think when we approach these ideas from a federal or provincial level, because we know as a city, we don't have the funds to pay for this. We need agreements from across the board with understanding that when Winnipeg does well, the province does well, the federal government does well. We are all meeting certain targets that we have. What does the federal government meet by helping us fund fast track this transit plan? Well, they meet some of their carbon emissions, targets. They meet some of their active transit targets. They meet some of their affordability targets. So they have a long list of things that active transit, effective, frequent transit would actually provide. But we never actually approach those discussions like that. And it's a skill set. I learned it in my law career when I started first negotiating with First Nations for water treatment plants and lagoons and infrastructure. We all came kind of to the table from a collaborative approach. This is not a collaborative approach. You're looking for negotiations. This is a negotiation that we're looking into. So I approached that funding differently. So what I want is 10 years. We have no reason that this can't happen in 10 years. 25 years later, we're going to be in a different situation. So what we need to do is at least get this master plan in place and have it reflect current demographics and people, and then we're going to have to reflect it. I think that the second failure is right now, and I'll be very blunt about it, is we somehow believe that this isn't a living document. Like we somehow believe that, okay, well, we're going to implement this master plan, and this is going to somehow be the plan for the next 40 years. That's not the way it works unless we completely stop immigration, until we completely stop the kinds of people who are living in our city, until we completely stop everything. So we have to always be thinking ahead. And I'll give you an example. There's no way that anyone could have known that there was going to be a Ukrainian and Russian war. Nobody could have known that we were going to have an influx of Ukrainian refugees, right? We couldn't have known that. So we can't really plan for things so stringent. We have to be more able to be fluid in those things. But the real key is the basic, bold infrastructure needs to be in place, and it needs to be movable. I'm a big believer in LRT. I've never in my life envisioned a city without LRT, so it's kind of alarming to me we still talk about it as if it's not happening or it's not something that the city needs. But that's a personal vision of mine. But sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you. And just one last question.
Sure.
You mentioned a lot of improvements to transit, the master plan, reducing fare fares, implementing electric buses.
Mhm.
How are you planning on prioritizing the budget?
That's a great idea. So, a great question, sorry. So you talked about, can I just, I want to focus on electric buses just right now, because, yeah. So I know I've taken a very specific position on electric buses, and as an individual who believes in human rights across the country, who understands globalization, who understands that what we do in this country actually affects other countries in the world, other people, I have to be very, very clear about my issue with electric buses. I am not going to be a electric buses for all, forever, without us actually understanding where those batteries are coming from. I do not believe that to create those batteries, it's we should be exploiting indigenous lands for the minerals that we need, that we don't have a place to, retire batteries that are done. We're not here to create a bigger issue. We're not here to have young kids in Congo, because that's where a lot of those batteries are going to be made, the minerals. Creating this system for us to pat ourselves on the back like we did really good. That's not what I'm looking for. So anything that comes into the city, I want to be a leader in that. I want to have some kind of very transparent understanding of what's coming into the city in terms of electric vehicles, especially citywide, city-run services providers, or our fleets, and just making sure that they're not coming into the city at the destruction of somebody else. We've already lived that world. I refuse to perpetuate it.
We need to move on to roads.
Please.
With Caleb.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Bokhari. I'm Caleb Duick. I'm covering the issue of roads. And first, I want to know what you generally think of the issue before, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure. So roads specifically?
Yes.
You know what? I think my answer to this is very simple. I acknowledge the fact that we can dream very big and we should be dreaming very big. But my goal immediately is to basically fix what we have. I don't feel like we should be, expanding various things when you can't drive 2 minutes without, you know, a $1,300 bill because you hit a pothole. So that's first off. I want to really spend at least 2 years, you know, making sure that our current infrastructure is up to date, that whatever issues that we have, and it is it's a deficit, right? We understand that there's an infrastructure deficit, that we haven't been doing what we need to do. We understand that there's weather issues. We've had all sorts of, you know, extraneous factors that have contributed to the awfulness of the streets that we are living on and the sidewalks as well. So acknowledging that, let's give it 2 years before I even acknowledge that we have to be expanding out in any way. I want to fix what we have currently. I want to understand how we could be investing millions of dollars every year, and 6 months later we have to invest in it again. So infrastructure is a big issue in terms of transparency and accountability for me. Is where's the money going? Why is it not being used effectively? How is it not working? And if it's not working, why do we continue to do the same thing over and over?
Right. Thanks. So, first of all, you have a lot of plans to reduce public parking spaces, but you don't have or seem to have any plans for renewing existing streets that are in poor condition. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's not so much that there's not a plan. I think that, you know, this has been the type of election where some things get said and some things don't get reported, and it's just the nature of it. But it's not so much not doing it. I think every candidate has priorities. And although my priorities are to ensure that the streets and the sidewalks and the ways that we move across the city are effective and safe, I definitely, again, will say that I would much rather have a very laser focus on what's currently in our city that needs to be fixed before I even think about what the expansion goals. And that's not to say that there's no vision for it. That's to say, post-COVID, during inflation, money has to come from somewhere. I don't know, you know, unless we find some very willing partner in the federal government, we'll have it'll be tough. But I will say this, so, I'm the only candidate who wrote to the federal Minister LeBlanc, about their current infrastructure plan. So they have the federal government has a infrastructure assessment plan at this moment right now that they're doing on their own dime. And I wrote to them almost 4 or 5 months ago, maybe even 6 months ago now, ensuring that Winnipeg would be included aggressively in that infrastructure plan. Now, why I did that, which is actually the right step to take if you want to be partners with the federal government, right? You want to make sure that your city is being addressed in those plans. So I did that for 2 reasons. Not only the roads and the roads and the basic infrastructure that we see every day, but there's also 720 kilometers of asbestos cement pipes that are in dire straits right now, which nobody wants me to talk about. And I will say this, that those pipes, before we talk about potholes, we should be talking about the potential poisoning of Winnipeggers. That's where my brain goes. That's really where my focus is that there's these pipes. If you haven't noticed, you'll see more and more water main breaks across the city. The federal government will say, well, we're following WHO's regulations when it comes to asbestos and water. I disagree. I think that there's enough evidence to say that when there is questions about asbestos fibers in water, we should definitely take a precautionary approach when it comes to the safety of people. Period.
Right. Thank you. And would you reduce the number of parking spaces across the city or just downtown?
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? I want to say across the city, but I think I would focus on downtown for now. I don't think across the city is where we're really having the issues. I think our issue is infill. The issue is filling up the spaces that we have in the city. We want housing. You know, we don't want to be expanding out, right? We want to try to fill in the city spaces that we have, build it up so we're not kind of paying for infrastructure to kind of grow out. So I would say downtown. But that's not to say, I don't want that to be, forever. That's my position. At this moment in time, that's my position.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's move on, please, to active transportation.
Hi.
How important is active transportation to you, and what do you plan to do with it?
Great question. You know, active transportation is one part of a bigger issue. It's one component of accessibility. It's one component of poverty reduction. It's one component of homelessness. It's a one component of a much bigger social issue. So it's deeply important. You know, without having a city where we can walk, bike, and try to get as many cars off the road as we can, especially those single-use vehicles, we're not going to be able to meet some of the environmental issues that we're going to face, which are happening right before our eyes. So that's kind of where my position is on active transport. Like I said, it requires investment, it requires infrastructure, it requires a lot of thought, it requires a lot of vision. And we also, I guess, you know, I know we always talk about buses, we talk about transit, you know, but I think, you know, in my mind, it needs to be much more diverse. Like, we need to start diversifying how we talk about active transit, right? It is, yes, it's the walkability of a city, it's the drivability of a city with buses, I guess. But it's also wheelchair accessibility. It's also seniors on scooters. It's also acknowledging the fact of active transportation. When we're creating those systems, need to acknowledge young families. Like, there's a whole host of things that need to be considered that reflect the current demographic that actually make up our city. So again, I'll say this, you know, we keep seeing the city through this lens, that it was the lens about 20 years ago. The city doesn't look like that anymore. The way that we're making plans is not actually what the city looks like. We have a huge demographic of people that don't look like everyone else, a lot of immigrant population, we have a lot of young families. Our plans need to be for that and for the seniors.
Your plan is to increase funding for safe, active transportation and secure bike lanes. What do you mean by safe and secure, and exactly how much funding is going to?
You know, safe and secure, it's a big thing, right? So I know that we kind of want to talk about, okay, well, transit safety. I know that's the big thing everyone wants to talk about. But safety also, for me specifically, it's about the basics in a lot of ways, right? It's about, you know, being able to get off a bus. I'll use an example. Getting off a bus in a space where there's enough lighting that I know that as a young woman in heels, I'm not going to get whatever. Like, I'll be safe. So when we talk about all of these things, we keep forgetting these safety components, especially for women. Like, I can name 20 places that I cannot go after 11 p.m., even if I had to, because there's just not enough lighting, it's not secure, there's no emergency buttons. So when I'm talking about safety, I'm talking about physical safety. I'm talking about the physical safety of those of us who, you know, we want to feel confident being around. So, and I think, again, I don't think this city was designed for women, bluntly.
And secure bike lanes, is there a specific type of infrastructure that you plan to?
No, I think secure bike, yeah, no, that's a great question. So secure bike lanes, you know, what we're trying to address here, I guess I'll approach this question this way. What we're trying to address here is, you know, is this understanding that there's both parties on the road, you know, and I really think that we need to start acknowledging the fact that it's very dangerous for bikers on the road right now. So how do we do that? Like, are there barriers protecting, you know, the folks in cars and the roads? Like, we have to review that. But I do think that a robust active transportation plan will reflect all of that, right? It has to reflect all of that. So whatever is in place right now, I think I've been very vocal about this for those who, you know, could hear it based on what's going on in this campaign. Anything that I'm talking about right now, so it doesn't matter what the plan is, I really needed to go through and be reflected through kind of a human rights lens, you know, a intersectional lens, a accessibility lens, to ensure that we're actually not just making plans that will perpetuate issues that were already there, just to say, oh, well, we had a great bike path and it worked. You know, we have to be much more broad in our approach to things. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
You're handling Shauna, so one of our, as you know, one of our students is teams again, as we call it.
I appreciate it. Hi, Shauna.
Hello. My name is Shauna Turnley, and my question is, what are your thoughts on homelessness in Winnipeg, and how do you plan to address it?
Yeah. That's a big question. I'm just trying to think of how to approach this so I can say what I need to say here. So we have visible homelessness and we have invisible homelessness. So if I start this conversation from that perspective, that we see things on the streets, we know people are struggling, so that's a affordable housing issue, low barrier to entry for housing and safe sites, 24-hour safe sites. We know that we have to do all of these things that should have been done already. But we also have to consider the fact that, there's a lot of people in this city who are also, in working poverty. Like, they live in very difficult situations. So we have to take this approach where we don't want those in that situation to fall across the board to the absolute homelessness situation. So we can't actually approach this just as those on the streets right now. We need to prevent it in that sense, but also ensure that what's happening on the street right now, which is disgusting, shouldn't happen again. So what do we do to deal with homelessness? Well, I think when we're talking about homelessness, there's no way that we can't talk about that we're not talking about poverty, we're not talking about drug addiction, and we're not talking about mental illnesses, because all of those things are combined. They're all intersectional, they all are related to each other. So as much as we want to talk about how do we house people, if we're doing that, are we ensuring that people have access to those homes? Is it low barrier entry to those homes? Are we ensuring that you don't have to be dry to be in one of these homes? So there's a whole host of things that have to happen. I mean, in terms of a tangible plan, I know that there's about 700, abandoned, we'll call them homes right now. I'm absolutely committed to giving those folks one last chance. Basically, the city has they have great legislation, great bylaws in place, actually, that just haven't been enforced to turn those homes into affordable housing. Again, I'm the only candidate who doesn't want to hand those homes over to developers. I think they should go into the hands of nonprofits. I mean, Habitat for Humanity is just the one that's top of my tongue. So from my end, those 700, as we proceed through it, will be going to social community organizations to create homes that are needed for those individuals who are currently facing homelessness. There's a need, and the only people who understand how to meet that need are those community groups. Government is not, we don't have that expertise. To pretend that we do is just going to perpetuate failure. It's not going to happen. So that's about 700 homes that we can start enforcing those issues and get moving on those right off the bat. But it's a homelessness and addictions issue that's more concerning for me.
Okay, so you speak of the handing over the derelict homes to nonprofits. How do you specifically plan to support these nonprofits in this construction process?
Great question. So out of all these, there's been, so there's two things. Number one, I understand very clearly that there's going to be a gap between taxes, right? Like, I know that we have to raise revenue in some way for the city because we're definitely not in good shape. But I think we should explore new sort of forms of revenue. I already talked about platform fees, which is about $2 to $2.5 million new revenue coming into the city. I've already talked about commuter issues, whereas making arrangements with our surrounding communities to ensure that everyone's paying their fair share. Winnipeggers cannot actually support everything that's going around us. We have to take difficult steps, again, that will increase some new revenue. I've also talked about reallocating 10% of the police budget to issues like this. This was the sole reason: addictions, poverty, homelessness, and that's why that 10% is a $32 million reflow of funding into community services. So we will have the ability to do that. We will have the funding to be able to support them.
Those are my questions, so thank you.
Thank you.
Which is a convenient way to get to the police
Oh.
budget. would.
Sorry, I should not start any conversation like that because this is unedited.
No problem. Obviously, the headline that you just gave was you were gonna cut the budget by $32 million or 10%.
It's 10%.
I'm gonna turn it over to Sierra Sanders to
Sure.
take us from there.
Hi, Sierra.
Hello, so I'm doing the police budget. I was just wondering, what are your initial, or I guess your thoughts and concerns about the Winnipeg police budget and the state that it's in right now?
It's not just the police budget. No, yeah, so let's just clarify. My issue is not simply the police budget. My issue is systemic racism. My issue is perpetuating issues against BIPOC, Indigenous, and Black individuals in this city. My issue is racial profiling. My issue is violence against people who, if they didn't look the way they looked, they probably wouldn't be shot and killed. Aisha Hudson, for example. So my issue with policing is much more deeper. It's not an issue because I deeply respect the service. It's not that. But I'm a little tired, like many of us who look like us, of, you know, on the one hand, lifting the service, but not actually calling out or acknowledging the fact that there are some very difficult issues that need to be addressed within that service. So 10% of the police budget being reallocated to community service is really just with 27% of the budget going to police right now, and us being in the state that we're in, rampant drugs, homelessness, poverty, people walking around the street with Narcan, 400 people dead on the street from ODing, police doing mental health checks, police finding people and having to lift them, more than one service member having to go to a home or deal with the social failure of this city is an absolute waste of taxpayer money. And as a steward of the public purse, I would never do that. So that's kind of the why. You know, the police have to do, and we have to support them in doing their job. And their job is to respond to crime and do it in the best way that they can based on their training. They are not social services. They do not have the expertise in terms of their training to deal with the mental health crisis that we are dealing with. If they want to help us when it comes to drug addiction, I would encourage them to stop and get the drugs off the street, perhaps. Whatever it is that we're sealing, that meth and fentanyl mixed, that violent drug that is consuming people in the street. I think that should be their job. Let's let community organizations who are doing the job with zero budget to do what they do best.
So I guess the general perception of the police in Winnipeg is pretty negative. Sorry, how do you plan to mitigate the negativity that Winnipeggers feel towards the Winnipeg Police Service?
Why would that be our? That's not my job. That's not our job to mitigate their relationship with people. That's their job. That is their internal job to make sure that they are not only in the face of the service, i.e. perhaps more people of color in the service might help. The fact that you can probably count how many people of color there are in the membership with one hand should be a question that we should ask. It's not our job, that's their job. Somebody said to me, and I've told this story before, someone said, well, how are you going to, build bridges or rebuild bridges between the police and the community? There were never bridges between Black Winnipeggers and the police. There was never been bridges between Indigenous Winnipeggers and the police. And there have never been bridges between our community and the police. These are new bridges that need to be created, and it's going to take all parties there, but they need to come to the table with an open mind.
Sure, that's all the questions I have.
Thank you.
And moving on to crime prevention, let's count it in.
Hi, my name is Kelvin. I'm going to be asking you a couple questions about crime prevention, so if I could just get your general thoughts. How you feel about crime prevention within the city, how it is being handled right now, and how you think it could be better in the future?
It kind of just goes back to the policing conversation. We have a drug issue in this city, a crisis in this city, borderline disastrous, and it's not just downtown. What we're dealing with, and I know some folks don't want to connect drugs to crime, and I'm unsure why, but perhaps we should review the fact that the type of drug that we're dealing with in the city, it's not pot, it's not marijuana, it's a vicious, vicious drug that even the most sincere individual, once they need it, would probably do anything to get it. So deeply addictive. So what we're seeing probably in crime and some of that petty crime, and I think we're starting to see that, the hatchets and the knives and the unprovoked attacks starting to happen. I think it's all just related to mental health and addiction, right? And so if we're not going to deal with the mental health and addictions, there's no real point in talking about crime. The crime, it'll continue, because the issues are, we have a mental health crisis on our hands. We need funding to go into mental health services, which will come from that reallocation of police budget, some form of that. And we need a specific drug strategy to combat the drug issues we have in our city. And one of those things is going to be in terms of public safety. So when we talk about crime, I'm talking about public safety, is going to be safe injection sites. What I would like to see, whether it's immediate, we need to at least have a mobile site and support the safe consumption sites that are already in this city that are just being bled dry because they're not getting the funding that they need. That's the other thing. We can't pretend that these organizations don't exist. They do exist. They've just never had the help that they needed. So that's why that reallocation of the police budget will also kind of lift them. But yeah, safe consumption sites, and people, I want to make it clear, and I thank you for the opportunity to do that. When individuals are in a place who are consumed by their drug, where they're not being judged, it's compassionate, it's a form of dignity that they can walk into a space and feel dignity, that they're not just some leftover on the street that we just want to judge. People are in that space for a reason. And what I'm trying to do with safe consumption sites is have a safe and respectful place that they can walk into and feel safe. They can walk into and feel safe. They could feel like humans, like they should. They could know that there are people there to help them and create trust relationships with them. Help them if they want to get off the drug. Help them if they want to stay on it. At least give them the safe needles, safe everything, so they're not going to lose themselves in other other health issues. Let's just create that space, because right now that is the only way to do this. That is the only solution forward. If anyone doesn't believe that to be true, they are not basing their decisions on evidence and facts. It's just a fact. So, as a person who believes in the value of all human beings, I think that one of the greatest social failures of our city is what we are seeing on the street right now. Nobody should be on the street. Nobody should be in bus shacks. Young kids shouldn't be walking around picking up needles. Families in Tuxedo and Charleswood shouldn't be wondering, should we be walking around with Narcan because there's a guy on our street here? Like, the system is completely broken. So when it comes to crime prevention, safe injection sites will not only treat those individuals with the dignity and respect that we need to do, but it'll also get those individuals off the street. While they're in their consumption, they won't be breaking into things. They won't be, targeting individuals. They'll just be in a different space. And, I believe it to be true, and I'm really committed to this.
And really quickly, if you could just talk about how, if you have any plans to address violent crime towards Indigenous women and girls within the city of Winnipeg.
Thank you. So what are we in, 6 months now? How long has this campaign been? 6 months? Can I just say that you're the only person in this entire campaign who's actually even brought this up? Thank you. I deeply appreciate that. At ground zero for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, if you could imagine that it wasn't an important enough conversation to come up anywhere else. Now, I brought it in everywhere else, but that in itself should speak to the systems and the institutions that we are dealing with right now. So I commend you for that question. So first off, when the taxi code of conduct came out, I was one of those people who were at City Hall when they first voted it down, may I remind you, and current people who are running right now were people who voted the code of conduct down. A code of conduct with a $250 fine. So when that happened, this was about last year, and there's three parts to this. So when that happened, I joined about 30 or 40 Indigenous women who had been victims of violence against themselves in cabs. And we all went to City Hall, and we were advocating because the first vote from council was to vote the code of conduct down against taxis. So they wouldn't have any kind of mechanism or teeth basically to hold themselves accountable. So myself, FNFAO, members from AMC, members from SEO, a lot of Indigenous leadership, we all go together. And we basically fought, and then it was the second vote when they heard that, okay, well, all these people are not gonna remain quiet. It was the second vote that they actually voted that code of conduct in against taxis. They didn't vote yes the first time. They voted no the first time. We had to fight for that yes, to get a basic code of conduct against taxis, which we know there's evidence of have been violent against women, Indigenous women. So that in itself should speak volumes about what we're actually dealing with. Secondly, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Again, this is a institutional issue. Policing have a lot to do with it. Services have a lot to do with it. CFS has a lot to do with it. Yes, it's a provincial issue, but there's a whole host of things. For me specifically, I leave this in the hands of Indigenous elders and leadership. I've spoken to many who will be the ones who are actually, and I'm there to support in any way, whether it's funding, whether it's policy, to ensure that we have a specific mandate, a strategy to combat MMIW. We need to get this, and I also want to advocate for some of these cold cases to be opened with Winnipeg Police. I mean, it's such a heavy topic. I think going into it, I'm just trying to think of a really powerful way that I can kind of tell you how deeply alarming it was for me, this entire campaign, that it never was brought up. Like, it's crazy to me. But yeah, so there will be a specific policy on that. Not even a policy, I don't want to say that. It's not a policy. I just want to give that direction, that support for any community organization. And also, they have the report out. MMIW has a report that was done this last 2 years, 3 years. I think that we also want to implement that. TRC calls to action, we're also going to implement those, anything to do with Indigenous women. And actually men, there's a lot of silence around the violence against Indigenous men as well, so I want to actually start to talk about that in youth as well. So a lot, that in itself should be a full part of a pillar of government right now, if I'm going to be really blunt.
You bump into a person on the street.
Mm-hmm.
They say, I've got 20 seconds to talk to you, Rana. Why should I vote for you? Go.
There is, I'm just, I'll leave it at this. We've done the same thing over and over. Voices like mine have never been represented, ever. I'm literally the first person who looks like me who's ever even ran. I come from a different lens. My view of this world is a human rights view. There's no other candidate who will take this city to a human rights level, a climate justice level, justice against Indigenous women and girls, an actual society that is functioning where we are respecting and treating everyone with dignity. That's it. That's what I'll leave it at. It's not always about money. Sometimes it's about people.
Thank you, Rana Bokhari, for
Thank you.
joining us this morning.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.